Hello and welcome to Chapter 2 of Crisis Communication. Today we're going to look at crisis theories and how theoretical orientations can help us to understand a crisis and the things that happen when a crisis unfolds. One of the interesting things about crisis communication from a theoretical perspective is thinking about how interdisciplinary this field is. In fact, crisis communication is studied in a lot of different places, or crisis-related topics are studied all over a university. It's of interest in psychology to study how individuals respond to a crisis. Sociology is interested in how institutions and communities brace for a crisis and respond and recover. The business field obviously is interested in the financial end and how do companies recover and re-establish their reputation and their business practices. Math and physics has helped us provide models to understand a lot of these variables. For example, the study of chaos theory has been a popular area in crisis study. Political scientists have a lot to say about crisis as it occurs in the political context, whether it be elections or policies or warfare. Obviously, in communication studies, we're going to be looking at these topics, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But all disciplines, engineering, computer sciences, everyone, mean that there are a lot of different ways for us to study the dynamics of a crisis and understand how they occur. So when you do research for this class, for a paper or for a topic, don't limit yourself only to what you know about from a communication standpoint. Other things are very relevant. And for those of you without a communication major or background, there are lots of things that you've studied that might be helpful to you in understanding crisis in addition to what we have to offer. Now, in crisis study, we look at theory from different perspectives. We're going to start with media-based theories, and there's a good chart in your textbook to talk about different media theories. Your textbook is highlighting 4 particular theories that are very common. They're often taught in a mass communication course in journalism. For those of you with some mass media background, will hopefully have been familiar enough to have heard about these theories before. There's further description in your textbook. Let me just quickly kind of explain in a thumbnail sketch what these mean. For example, news framing suggests that the media is capable of deciding what kind of crisis things are. How does the media choose to frame or depict a crisis? Is it a good or bad thing? Is it a study of disaster or failure, or is it a study of heroes? So one of the things we look at from a media framing perspective is how is the media talking about a crisis? How are they presenting it? Who are they assigning blame to? The media has some choices to make, and they don't always equally or evenly depict a crisis. And in some respects, as we'll learn, it's possible for the organization facing a crisis to help frame the crisis to the media and help impact how the media decides on reporting the issue. News framing is an important component, and there's more in your textbook on it. Focusing on events is something related to news framing. How newsworthy, for example, is the story? Is it a positive or negative story? Is it a normal crisis? Are there lessons to be learned? Again, the media often determines which piece of a crisis do we focus on. In some cases we focus on the victims. In other cases we focus on the perpetrators. So for example, when there's a school shooting, what stories do you offer? Do you talk about the children or people who have died at the hands of the shooter, or do you focus more on who shot the weapon and their background? Is it an act of terrorism versus an act of domestic violence? Is it a topic for gun control or mental illness? It's interesting to look at what policy implications might be behind a crisis. So when we have a shooting, people are often calling for more gun control, or if we have some other violence issue, people are looking for maybe mental health topics. If we're looking at a food poisoning case, we're looking at better restrictions and control over food quality. If we want businesses to stop ripping us off and cheating us, then we're looking at legal restraints and constraints and enforcements in the legal system. So news framing helps to establish how the crisis is described, and focusing events often take what are often complex topics and focusing on those particular elements that are worthy of reporting. And they help then to impact the direction we take as audiences in terms of what we think about a crisis and what we know. There are two other media-based theories that are relevant for us to think about. The first is what we call news diffusion. News diffusion has been studied for a long time. It's interested in how do people learn about a crisis. In other words, what is your source of information? You guys are a little young for the most part, but I remember, for example, when 9/11 hit, how I first heard about it or where I was at the time, and how that information was distributed to me. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when President Reagan was shot. I know exactly where I was at the time and what source was available to me to hear about that particular shooting. We started a lot of these studies back when JFK Kennedy was shot and killed as president. But we are interested, especially with social media and other kinds of things, how quickly do people learn about a crisis and what are their sources of information, and how do those sources of information help them or hurt them. When I was teaching in Illinois, I was teaching at a small college in southern Illinois, and there was a shooting up at Northern Illinois University, and within an hour of that shooting, I had students receiving text messages and emails from friends of theirs on that campus to my campus talking about the crisis. News diffusion studies are interested in looking at how do people talk about a crisis. How does word get out there, and as a result, what that word is about a crisis. There's also a new area of study called exemplification theory, and this is focusing on the fact that crises include emotionally laden messages, oftentimes visual, but also language, that impact the way people see a crisis. So when you see bodies that have been killed in a crisis or an attack, you see the death, the destruction, the fear, the horror of a crisis. Does that impact the way people think about it or remember it or process it? The picture you have here is something that will be talked about in a later chapter, and that is what was called the pink slime debate and the beef industry, which affected a number of producers here in Iowa. Photos like this of this pink kind of slimy, almost looks like bubble gum or something, had a big impact on what people thought about what pink slime is and how it affects their diet. It is possible to visually depict crises in ways that are impactful, and so as a mass media theory, these four theories talk about how the communication of a crisis to publics impact the way the public views them. There are other theories that we're going to be looking at. Some are what we call organizational communication theories. Things like corporate apologia. Apologia is not an apology, but rather it's a defense strategy. How do organizations defend themselves against a possible crisis? And they have a number of options. And your textbook and other resources will talk about what are the choices organizations have in order to respond to a potential crisis. Do they admit it? Do they apologize? Do they deny it? Do they attack their accuser? How do they respond? Apologia strategies are looking at how organizations respond and provide an accounting or an excuse or an explanation for their role in a crisis. A second organizational theory is what we call image repair theory. This is one that has been very popular. It talks about how do organizations protect their image or reputation. Many groups are concerned that a crisis will impact their long-term reputation and image in the eyes of public. So they want to develop campaigns and ideas that will help protect their bottom line and their interest in the long haul. So image repair theory is often a discussion of how well or poorly an organization defends itself under that kind of criticism. Situational crisis communication theory is another popular theory that looks at reputational threats. How does an organization get threatened by their reputation during a crisis, and they recommends possible responses. Situational crisis theory as well as image repair theory provide a whole kind of checklist of options, and you can't do them all, but the result is that communicators have to be selective and strategic in deciding how they want to respond to their crises. Those two theories provide a lot of options and provide us with a lot of ways to understand crisis responding. Finally, the organizational renewal theory. I talked about this earlier, and it will be talked about in different parts of the book. This is about finding those opportunities that a crisis presents to organizations. How do organizations learn? How do they act ethically to prevent future crises? How can they move past a crisis into a new future? And that theory will come to bear a lot near the end of the term. So these organizational theories are where, for the most part, crisis communication studies began. We've added mass media theories, and we've also added an interest in other areas as well. But you could easily go through the business literature and find suggestions there. And there are some good theories in sociology and psychology that you could add to your list of potential theory also. So as you're working on papers or you're working on projects, don't be afraid to look at other theories that might be relevant too. A couple practical suggestions at this point. Think about a crisis as both a threat and opportunity. Try to process what you learn about a crisis in terms of its long-term implications. Think about how theory will play a role in understanding how a crisis unfolds, how we should respond, and how we should study it. We don't just study a crisis by reporting on the events. We need some framework, some set of theory, some structure to our study that allow us to identify the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses, the choices made, and to reach some conclusions about how and why those choices were successful or not. We need theory in order to help us solve the challenges that a crisis creates for us. We will be looking in particular later in the class about best practices. What are those practices that are best suited for repairing and supporting a company? For example, we know that apology works. Most people would advise organizations to have some kind of apology as part of their response to a crisis. Now, the lawyers don't like that. The lawyers don't like companies to reply by apologizing because that's admitting doing something wrong, and lawyers never want to admit fault. But we have found that apologies of a particular type sometimes are the most effective way to move past a crisis. People will forgive, but you have to ask for it before they will. Your authors also talk at the end of this chapter about threat bias. Read carefully what that talks about. I'm not going to talk about it in much detail here. But think about how the threat of a crisis impacts the way people respond. So at the end of the second week here, we've looked at definitions of a crisis. We've looked at some theories that we're going to apply to crisis situations. And beginning next week, we're going to start looking at some specific case studies. This week we have discussion questions. We'll have them every other week. They're pretty open-ended, but I'm going to ask you to both write your response to these discussion questions on the Facebook site and try and do that early in the week so that later you can look at other responses people have had in their postings, and I want you to reply back to a few of them so we can start this sort of dialogue and discussion. I'm going to ask you a couple kind of open-ended questions. For example, what kind of a crises have you experienced? Maybe you could share an example of a crisis or two that you've been involved in. And if you really feel you don't have any crises to personally reply to, look at what's newsworthy. What is happening in the news right now, and what do you think is the kind of crisis of the day and the kind of crises that are maybe worth studying right now? The second thing I want you to do is, having identified some crises that you've been through or ones that you're familiar with in the current news, what have they taught you about communication practices? What expectations did you have in learning about them or experience of them? What did you learn about being more effective or a lack of effectiveness? We learn from both success as well as failure in crisis studies. So what did you learn by watching the crises you've been exposed to? So post those responses, reply back to others. You'll get points essentially for both posting your own answer to the questions, but then also replying to others. And I don't just mean you replying to what people said to you about your post, but replying to other people's posts. I found that we could have some great discussions, and that some of you are really good at kind of growing a discussion out as far as possible. So this first week, we're going to kind of look at your baseline, what you know, what you've experienced, how you feel about a crisis. And then we'll start using what you know and the theory you've learned to start applying our understanding of crisis communication to case studies. So take care of the discussion questions this week, and I will see you next week with Chapter 3.